Hello, everybody. I'm Joel Heitkamp. I'm the host of News and Views on the Mighty 790 KFGO, actually on a number of radio stations. I'm a former state senator, well, you might know what my bio is. I promise you, as a state senator and as a radio host, I won't shamelessly promote our product, mention my radio station. Well, never mind. We'll get to that in a little bit. Over the last few years, whenever someone talks about helping rural America, the conversation seems to always turn to the topic of rural broadband. It's a big and complicated issue with a lot of moving parts. It really is. And it's happening all across the country. Now, President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law in the American Rescue Plan provided significant funding to finish building our nation's broadband infrastructure and create programs to make broadband more affordable to foster digital access equity among communities. And although these programs have made significant progress, they're also faced with some significant setbacks recently as well that we need to talk about today. Our panel will discuss all things broadband and help bring some clarity to something that's often discussed but rarely understood as a topic. We have four great speakers, actually three, that are going to be joining us. First, I'd like to introduce Nathan Zacharias. Now, Nathan is a technology policy analyst at the Association of Minnesota Counties. Nathan also serves as the director of the Minnesota County IT Leadership Association. He focuses on broadband technology, data practices. Yeah, absolutely great resume and somebody who lives right next to me. The other individual I want to introduce, and listen to this resume, Danielle Davis. Danielle is the Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, where she leads the organization's technology policy program. Her primary area of focus encompasses broadband adoption and access, content moderation, and privacy issues. She brings a wealth of experience to her role as a highly accomplished attorney, specializing in technology and telecommunication laws, policy development, and civil rights advocacy. And now our third panelist, we're going to call him Nathan 2. How's that, everybody? Nathan 2, Nathan Leamer, is currently the CEO of Fixed Gear Strategies. Previously worked as a vice president of public affairs at Targeted Victory and served as a policy advisor to FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. Now, I had a chance to meet Chairman Pai at one time, living in the world I live now in the radio world. And so congratulations to him for working with him. Now, I want to welcome all of them to the Rural Progress Summit. Thank you guys for joining us, all of you for just coming along and being part of this discussion. I want to throw some questions at you to give you a chance for everybody to answer them. The FCC estimates at least 9.3 million rural residents have inadequate, the key word there being inadequate, broadband service. This affects rural communities' ability to retain residents, generate tax revenue, and attract employers. If you could say a couple sentences to every member of Congress and senator about what they need to do to support broadband for every home and business in rural America, what would you say? And Danielle, I'm going to go to you first on that.
Thank you so much, Joel. Thank you for having me. If I could talk to every senator or Congress member, I would basically tell them that broadband access is a critical lifeline, especially for Black communities in the rural South, whereby 1/3 of residents lack adequate internet access. The digital divide exacerbates existing disparities, limiting education opportunities, healthcare access, and economic development. So investing in broadband infrastructure can help close those gaps, empowering Black families to fully participate in the digital economy, access telehealth services, and also benefit from remote learning opportunities that we saw were so important during the pandemic. So supporting broadband for every home and business in rural areas is not just a technological necessity, which it definitely is, but it's more of a moral imperative to address systemic inequalities and ensure the future prosperity and resilience of our nation.
Well said, and true. Flat out true. We're gonna go with Nathan one. You you go ahead and answer that one.
Thank you. I work a lot with this Minnesota State Legislature in my job, and so I like to make this comparison on broadband when I'm speaking with state legislators here in Minnesota, which is the land of perpetual road construction. We spend untold millions in Minnesota and across the country on highway construction in the US. Now, if somebody came to you and told you that you could build an interstate and that for 30 years never needed to be resurfaced, you couldn't get potholes, didn't have to plow it, never needed additional lanes for increased traffic, and it cost between $20,000 and $50,000 a mile, would you build it? And the answer is always, obviously, yes. That's a fiber network, and that's how I try to get state legislators to think about broadband.
I'm gonna go, Nathan. You go ahead on this one. I won't even call you two. How's that?
It sounds good. We can figure it out. First off, thanks again for having me. It's a pleasure to join these esteemed panelists and yourself for this conversation that is really important. And the first thing I would say to any member of Congress, and I've had the opportunity of saying to many members of Congress, is that this is a bipartisan win opportunity for any member. There are constituents on both sides of the political aisle who have a need for next generation connectivity in their rural communities. And there are some solutions and there's frameworks that whether it's with the FCC or Capitol Hill, NTIA or others, that members can come together and actually deliver this incredibly important level of next generation opportunity to allow the future generations to flourish in those communities, whether it's leveraging precision agriculture, whether it's connecting for next generation education and just kind of the workforce of tomorrow. This is so pertinent now because as AI develops and as we are on the verge of a whole new generation of technologies, if we're not servicing these communities now, it's only going to exacerbate that digital divide that we know exists, and it's going to make it so much harder 10, 15, 20 years to solve that problem.
So those are the reasons. I understand that. I want to follow up, if I could, on something along the line of practical. When people think of those highly populated states, they think a place like California, New York, Texas, those type of places. But every one of the places I just named have massive rural areas. I mean, they do. They have massive farm, culture. To me, every state needs this. And so knowing that those members in Congress and those two senators that everyone has understand that, I guess, do you think they'd listen? I mean, that's what I'm really want to get at. Do you believe that they would listen, Nathan?
I'll take that one. I'm
Okay.
Nathan too in this situation. I'll jump in that.
I'll start saying two. Just don't be offended by
That's
that.
good.
Okay.
No, I won't take offense.
Yes.
But I will say one of the best opportunities to make members pay attention is to actually tell the stories of those who are connected. And you mentioned in California, one of the things I think is so important is to have the small businesses and the farm communities be able to say, this is what we could have with this next generation connectivity. One of the things I think we miss in DC is we have a lot of K Street lobbyists. We have a lot of people, insiders telling what's going on. But whenever members actually hear, this is a school that is benefiting from this. These are students that are benefiting from this. This is a woman-owned entrepreneurial endeavor that now has an opportunity of hiring 10, 15 employees because of this, or so on and so on. I think that's actually a winning story because in DC, when you talk about millions and billions of dollars, millions for this, billions for that, it almost sounds like white noise, in my opinion. But when you actually tell these real stories of actually lives transformed and communities transformed, that should be able to help members see, oh, there's a path forward, and this is why I should work for this endeavor.
We'll work backwards. Nathan, two, or one, I should say.
I completely agree. And that strategy is something that we've employed here at the Minnesota legislature. Telling those stories is really, really important. When there's a hearing on broadband funding in a committee or on the floor, we will bring in just a regular average person from a community that has a story to tell, and those are often the most important things. And as a lobbyist myself, I think Nathan's completely right. They are hearing all the time from political professionals on this, And when you hear about a family or a business or whatever it is, telling their story about the importance of a connection or not having a connection, it really moves them to make decisions and make change. I think of one story in particular. The gentleman from the Minnesota Farmers Union who testified, this must be 4 or 5 years ago by now. He told a story in committee about how his grandparents' farm in Minnesota, back in the 1930s or early 1940s, when they got electricity, finally ran to their farm in rural Minnesota. He said his grandparents sat at the kitchen table and they wept, and you could hear a pin drop in the committee room when that story was told.
Danielle, you said something, and I don't want to stop you from responding to that, whether or not the congressmen and senators will pay attention. And I hope you expound on that. But you said something that jumped out at me as well. We all know about education, we know about equalization, we all know about that. But you said rural health, and I can tell you, being married to an RN, that's huge. That's absolutely huge. And if you would speak to those two things.
Well, first, I would say I would agree with my co-panelists. Like, conveying the stories to Congress, I think hits more of a nerve than just reiterating policy, things that they already kind of know in theory anyway, but talking about the actual lives that the policies are actually affecting and improving their lives, I think that is the way to go. But as far as the telehealth situation, that is a huge thing. I have family in the Black rural South, and them being able to talk with their doctors and figure things out just over line, when getting to a doctor is not as simple as just hopping in your car and going down the street for them. A lot of the time that is a serious journey to get to a doctor or a hospital. So I think that broadband is essential in that regard, as it's also a lifeline for many rural residents.
And I'm going to go down this road, you guys. It's going to be a little bit repetitive, but broadband seems to be that answer to a question that's rarely asked, I might add, but it also seems to solve every problem in rural America, especially in election years. Now, we all know what we went through there in the last years. It's been said to be the economic answer for small businesses, applied agribusiness technologies, workforce development, education opportunities for both students and educators, increasing telehealth. But in all place of universal cure, what do you see as the most vital that America still has for building out, rebuilding up, and making sure that we all have broadband? I'll go to Nathan one.
Thanks. I think that your framing of this question is totally spot on. Saying you support broadband, especially in an election year, is kind of like saying you support music or ice cream. It's like a total layup. But at the same time, I think that's a testament to the work that the advocates have done for many years on messaging, because it wasn't always this way. I remember not long ago when a lot of people, including elected officials, still saw broadband as a luxury, not a necessity. Now, if we wipe away all the obvious economic benefits and all of the obvious educational benefits and ask ourselves, how do we frame this question in a different way? I think, in my opinion, we have to start talking about this in generational terms. I challenge anyone to ask a millennial or a Gen Zer if they're going to buy a house that's totally unconnected to the internet. I don't have data to back this up, and I don't have a study, but I'd be real surprised if more than 20% would be okay without any connectivity. And rural communities, here in Minnesota, across the country, as we all know, we're fighting to keep young people in town or to get them to move back home after they're done with college. And at a minimum, these people are going to want to be connected to the internet. So in my mind, broadband has to be framed as a sort of base level service that are going to help communities retain their young workers.
Danielle?
Yeah, I completely agree. It definitely needs to be framed, but it also needs to go deeper and not just saying like, okay, well, we need broadband. We know that, but what does that actually mean? And for me, that means also ensuring the infrastructure is in place to provide that reliable high-speed internet and access to every home. So when we talk about that, a key aspect of this for me is addressing pole attachments. And pole attachment issues are essential for deploying broadband networks as they allow internet service providers to use these existing utility poles to expand their networks quickly and cost effectively. So in my opinion, simplifying the regulatory process, which can be a bit much for a lot of these ISPs, and reducing the costs associated with pole attachments, we can accelerate the deployment of broadband infrastructure in rural areas. And in my opinion, this would ensure that small businesses can thrive and farmers can utilize advanced agribusiness technologies, and students and educators can have the access to the essential educational resources that they need.
Nathan, too.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Danielle mentioned pole attachments, because it is not top tier issues like pole attachments that are actually really important. You mentioned, we talk about rural broadband in election years, but the reality is that it's a multi-year process, and every season has different challenges, and they're before every level of government, whether it's at the local level, the county level, as Nathan number one knows, or the state, or even federal level. And one thing that is so important is whether it's pole attachments, whether it's the streamlining of overall infrastructure deployment processes. What is so important is making sure that people are engaging with their state and local officials. We so often miss that. We so often forget that. But so many states now have rural broadband offices, and for people to make their voices heard before those rural broadband offices, to explain not just why pole attachments are important in a macro sense, but also how it actually affects a community. Saying this particular town in Midland, Michigan, or this particular community outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, two places where I've lived, so I reference them. That's why they're important. So I think that's such a huge part of the conversation, is making sure that these aren't just biannual conversations, but are perennial discussions that understand that there's a gamut of issues that must be addressed, and to discuss them at a regular basis.
Well, speaking as someone, and there's others on this panel that understand quite well what I'm about to say, who knows what it's like to have the frost go 7 feet in the ground on a bad winter. I think a lot of what we're talking about needs to be talked about. I want to follow up on one thing we talked about. Why is it so hard to get Congress to see this value? I mean, why is it? Urban America takes so much of this just for granted. And other areas, I think that we're ahead of it a little bit in the rural area, are fortunate enough. And I'm one of those. We had strong leadership. And quite frankly, we had the good fortune of having a guy named Byron Dorgan be a U.S. Senator. But he saw what this was going to be for the rural area years ago. And I think it kind of slipped under before anybody really realized, if that makes any sense. And I'm going to go with Nathan too on that.
Yeah, so I think one of the problems is actually a messaging and marketing issue, which is that we talk so much about technology on the edge. It's such a hip thing to talk about, whether it's social media platforms or AI or these future emerging technologies, that we don't always think about the basics. And so one of the things that I was always proud of my old boss for doing, I think the current FCC chairwoman, Jessica Roseworcel, has continued to do this, is to get out and be a cheerleader on these issues, working in the communities. Chairman Pai went to all 50 states. We had a big deal about going across the country. I know Jessica is doing the same thing. And so I think there's a huge value in leveraging these policymakers, Alan Davidson and others, to be out in the communities and helping remind members of Congress, we're in your backyard. This is why this is important. Here's the community. Here's the people who are benefiting from this. We should be working together on these endeavors. And so I would start out with that, like making sure that even though it's a lot of these telecom issues are wonky, all attachments included, the reality is they have real major effects and can benefit people. And we need to continue to make sure that people are trumpeting this. That's why this type of conversation is so important as well.
It's never sexy. I mean,
know.
it isn't. Once you build the sewer pipeline, It's in the ground. It's done. You know it's there. You take advantage of it. And once you build the water line and once you put the curb and gutter in it, none of these things are sexy, but we all need them. Danielle, I want you to take a run and don't make reference to what I just did. I promise you don't have to.
Uh, that's hilarious. But this is honestly a great question, because at one point I would have said it was a lack of awareness, and there may be some gap in awareness or understanding among some members of Congress about the specific challenges and the needs of rural communities, particularly those of the Black community in the Black rural South. But I think that after the pandemic, we are all very clear on what the challenges are for both urban and rural communities. It's not rocket science at this point. We saw what the costs were when you did not have access to broadband internet. And it essentially means that you cannot participate in modern society in a meaningful way anyway. So if I had to put my finger on it, I wouldn't say it's a lack of awareness. I would say that the political dynamics play a huge role. And the political landscape can impact the prioritization of broadband initiatives, the partisan divides, the differing policy priorities can slow down the legislative process. Additionally, rural broadband projects might not receive bipartisan support if they are seen as benefiting certain constituencies more than others. And I believe that, and I know that this isn't necessarily about broadband affordability, but I believe that this type of issue that I just discussed has been reflected in the most recent Affordable Connectivity Program funding debates that we're seeing right now in Congress.
Well, Nathan, one, I don't know too many states that are as diverse in terms of the people that represent you in the halls of Congress and their beliefs. I mean, if you look at the members of Congress that you have, and I know most of them, what you're going to find is a lot of different philosophies on the role of government. How do you fix that? I mean, how do you convince them that this is such a high priority that they should be unified?
Yeah, well, I think to some extent the federal delegation in Minnesota is fairly supportive of broadband initiatives. And you mentioned we do have a wide partisan and philosophical range of opinions here in Minnesota. It's something that we're quite proud of in a way in Minnesota. And, of course, we're the unique Minnesota state. Everything about us is, quirky and unique. It's a big thing. But you asked how is it so, or why is it so hard for Congress to see the value in this? And I think, quite honestly, I think Danielle hit it right on the head. Everything changed with COVID. Like the awareness, everything changed after that. I remember sitting shortly after the state of Minnesota shut down. I remember sitting and writing talking points with our rural broadband coalition here, going, "This is it. Like everybody's going to finally see why internet at home is so important." But for why it's hard for Congress, it is, but I think that the BEAD funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is testament to how far we've come. And this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get very, very close to full connectivity. And I think that the best part about this program is that the funds are going to flow directly to the states, and that the states are going to manage the rollout of these projects. Because, for instance, Minnesota's got a broadband grant program here, and we've had it for a decade. And our communities across the state, local governments and ISPs are familiar with the rules of this program. And so we're working with NTIA to use our state grant program's rules with some modifications to meet the requirements to serve as the vehicle for federal BEAD funds. In the decade or so that I've been working on this issue, I've never seen anything like this BEAD program come down from Congress. So I'm a bit more optimistic on Congress getting it done on this. Other things, maybe another conversation, but on this particular thing, I think they've done a pretty good job with this one.
I think you're very fair, very honest when it comes to. I want to talk about wireless and wired. I want to talk about fiber and where some of that is going. What can be done to make sure, because you really can't have wireless without fiber. And I'm not sure that people understand that, the sheer mechanics of it. I worked very closely with our rural broadband companies here in my home state in North Dakota, and they walked me through at different times, the mechanics of it. And I also think, because this next question really I want it to involve small businesses and farmers, I don't think they know what we do. I don't think that they realize that today tractors can run on their own. And I don't think that they realize that at any given point that farmer can see exactly what part of his field is wet. And it's all about data. I mean, it's all about, hey, you put a little more fertilizer down here. And it's all about the ability to garner information, thus fiber, which is a huge advantage in what they do and in the investment they make. I'm gonna go to Nathan too to try to figure out where the question was and all that.
So I do think it speaks to what you're getting at, which is that different technology serves different purposes and they all fit in well together. And I think the important part is to recognize that in some rural areas, there are some people who are sitting on spectrum not leveraging it to the best of its ability, and therefore not able to take it to the next generation connectivity. And so how do we right size that? How do we have a balanced approach that allows all ships to rise, whether it's topographical challenges, whether it's regional challenges, but also recognizing how do we make sure that the best technology is getting in the hands of those that need it. And that's a huge reason why the conversation in front of rural broadband offices is so important, to make sure that we have that right balance, to make sure that the next generation connectivity that you guys are describing is getting to those people that need it most.
I'm going to kick that to you, Danielle. What do you think about that?
I completely agree with Nathan. And I will also say, just on that same topic, not to necessarily overthink this, like providing technical support and training for rural businesses and farmers to optimize their use of available internet technologies is also vital, just like essentially what Nathan just said. Educating users on best practices for maintaining connectivity and troubleshooting issues can also enhance reliability. And finally, I will also say investing in next generation internet services that can also provide reliable internet to even the most remote areas. So just, thinking outside the box, also just working with what we have.
Nathan, one?
Yeah. So wireless service itself, and in particular fixed wireless, like you mentioned with that fiber backhaul, has made, it's made leaps and bounds over the last 5 years, even when it comes to reliability. But I'm going to take a little bit more of a bearish approach on this. And I'm only speaking to my experience in Minnesota. There are still a lot of fly-by-night fixed wireless providers out there that exaggerate the range of their towers or promise speeds that they can't deliver. And a lot of them snooker people into expensive contracts. And so they get really, disconnected and, like, nothing's ever going to reach me. I've been told a million times I'm going to get service, and then this is just the next thing, and maybe they give up. But the solution, in my opinion, is to build as much fiber as possible. And I mentioned the comparison to the highway construction earlier. Yes, fiber is expensive compared to other technologies. You can more affordably serve people with a wireless tower than you can putting a fiber optic cable to every single house. I recognize that. But it is the fastest and most reliable service available, and its scalability is incredible. There's ISPs in Minnesota right now offering 8 gig symmetrical service. But on the other hand, I do understand the need to stretch limited public investments in broadband as far as you can go. But a part of me, and this is where I get a little bearish on this, a part of me is very worried that the countryside is going to be told once again, you get a service that isn't quite as good as what people in the city get. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think that rural communities deserve access to the same technology that people in cities or regional centers have.
No, I couldn't agree more. And that's a great point. The perception of whether or not they're subsidizing, when in fact that the rural electrics went through the same thing. The rural electrics, the investor-owned utilities didn't want them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. It cost too much money per meter. And then the next thing you know, these grew and grew and grew and became economically viable. And the next thing you know, they wanted part of that territory. So you bring an absolutely great point. I'm going to send this one to Nathan one. Minnesota's been praised as one of the states getting it right when it comes to the build out of rural broadband. Can you tell us about the strategies? How did you do it? How close are you to completing that last mile?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the specific shout out. And once again, Minnesotans across the country will love to hear that we're a model for something. The short answer is we're very close.
Nathan one, I'm a Vikings fan, so you can go ahead and fix a lot of those things for me.
Yeah, that's right. We've still got a lot of work to do, though, here in Minnesota. We've got 92% of the state covered with 25 by 3 megabits per second, and 88% of the state covered with 100 by 20. Sounds good, but if you break those numbers out according to rural areas, it looks a little different. You get 78% with 25 by 3 and only 68% with 100 by 20. The only reason we've been able to come as far as we have is because of super strong grassroots advocacy. We've also got a state broadband office with an absolutely sterling reputation from communities and at the state legislature too. It's not often that a state agency is universally loved by the state legislature, and our Office of Broadband certainly is. We also have buy-in from local governments, and we had really strong statewide coalition building. Until late or early 2022, I was the lobbyist for the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition. And our primary goal was, at the time, as we called it, to fund the fund. We got everyone in the state who cared about broadband together. Doesn't matter who you were welcome. We got small business owners, farm groups, townships, counties, economic development agencies, private philanthropic organizations, and yes, even the telecommunications industry trade groups. We brought them to the table and said, we all got to sit together and figure this out. And we all agreed on two things. The state legislature needed to spend more on broadband infrastructure. And number two, that broadband was not a partisan issue. We used to have competing GOP and DFL, or DFL is our state Democratic Party, but we used to have competing partisan proposals on how much to fund it. We said, pardon this, but screw that. Like, everybody get on one bill. We're all going to agree that this is important. And it worked. It took a few years, but it worked. And one of the most important things that we did was to create the lower population density grant program. So our state grant program does a 50% match, 50% state funds, 50% ISP, and local match. The lower population program offers 75% state match. And we thought that this was a good way to address what we found was a catch-22 in rural broadband. The less dense your population is, the smaller the tax base, and the less likely that a county or township or town government could contribute to a broadband grant. And of course, these areas are where it's most expensive to build broadband. So there's your catch-22. But if there's one thing that you take away from all of the babbling that I've done on broadband today, it's this: you have to get local buy-in. And that's what we've done here. You have to work with your county or your town board, develop a broadband working group, a subcommittee, whatever it is. Use this to survey your residents on their willingness to use public funds for broadband. Are they satisfied with their current broadband, whatever it is? Identify areas in your communities that don't have service, identify areas that need help with digital literacy or affordability. Once you have all that information, then you invite the ISPs to maybe a county board meeting or a township board meeting. Let them know, this is all the information we have. This is what we want to do. We're willing to work with you. And then ask them to create proposals to build out to unserved areas through the grant program. So that's essentially how we've done it. And this kind of collaboration is what I think is what it's going to take to finally connect everybody.
Danielle, this is so important. The next question here, the highlight, and we need to highlight on Black Americans in rural areas and how they've benefited from broadband access through the Affordable Connectivity Program. Tell us about this. Tell us about your finding, the impact that you're seeing there. Could you tell us a little about the Joint Center's findings, the impact of and how this helps rural Black South Carolinians?
Yes, absolutely. So, according to our 2021 report on broadband access and affordability in the Black rural South, and according to FCC data in the Black rural South, 25.8% of residents lack the option to subscribe to high-speed broadband internet. And even where the broadband is available, many find it extremely unaffordable. And in that report, it's also estimated that U.S. households with incomes less than 35,000 are much less likely to have broadband. And these households account for 28.6% of households nationwide, but 68.8% of Black households in the Black rural South. So that's huge. And clearly there's a significant economic issue here. So the Affordable Connectivity Program has the potential to benefit Black households who need affordable internet access the most. The eligibility for the program is limited to those earning at or below 200% of the poverty line, which sometimes that shakes out to about 60,000 for a family of four I guess, in 2023. But it also is extended to those eligible for certain social assistance programs, such as SNAP, WIC, Medicaid, and other programs. But nearly over 38% of Black Americans live below the 200% poverty line in 2022, making them eligible for the support that the ACP offers. So by providing affordable broadband access, the ACP helps to bridge this digital divide. It ensures that Black families in the Black rural South can access essential services, the educational opportunities, and the economic resources just like the rest of the country. So this investment is crucial, in my opinion, for fostering equity and empowering these communities to actually thrive. But in addition, the Joint Center's research has highlighted that improved broadband access in rural South Carolina, for example, has enabled more Black residents to enter the state's growing tech sector. So with reliable internet, there comes individuals can also access online training and certification programs. They can search for and apply for tech jobs, and they can even work remotely, which most of us right now are pretty much doing. This connectivity has essentially opened up new career paths, contributing to a more diverse and inclusive tech workforce, which is very important. Just to take an aside, like only 8% of Black America is represented in the tech space, and only 3% of those 8% are actually in executive roles. But outside of that, it's also going to stimulate the local economy growth. But the ability to participate in the digital economy is essentially transforming lives all over the Black rural South and all over America, and it's helping to build a more equitable and prosperous future for these communities.
Do you think, Danielle, America got it after COVID? I mean, COVID had to have changed a lot of what we're talking about. You're looking for this reliable workforce. You're looking for people that have just been consistent, hardworking people. Small businesses, those type of things. What role do you think COVID played in everybody waking up to what you just said?
It showed what broadband access really meant. I think, beforehand, to certain people who were, going to their family's house to use internet, and, going to third spaces such as McDonald's and other places to use the internet, they probably already knew like what not having internet meant, like they got it. But now the rest of America who, well, where we're taking it for granted, I believe one of my panelists said earlier, where in urban America, where we're taking it for granted, maybe we can't afford it, maybe it's hurting our pockets, but we have it. I think it just shined a light on how imperative it was just for modern life. Like you literally cannot live in a meaningful way without, I won't say meaningful, I will say in a modern way, without access to broadband internet, essentially. So,
well, and what I noticed was employers that probably didn't care before so desperately needed those employees that they did care now. And they knew that this whole notion of either you have it or you don't have a job here, all of us knowing rural areas the way we know them, the biggest concern we have in rural areas isn't whether or not we can create jobs anymore. The question is where we can find workers for those jobs. And so that's such a huge part of what we're talking about here. Nathan, too, I'm going to ask you this. You've written pretty extensively about the dig once strategy of installing conduits large enough to support future expansion of broadband infrastructure without impacting surrounding built infrastructure. How has dig once progressed? How is it over the years, and can it help close that last mile of service in those rural areas?
Yeah, so I would say Dig Once fits into the deployment side of efforts to close the digital divide. I think Danielle did a really eloquent job of explaining the adoption side of it and the need for more adoption of next generation connectivity, but also how do we best get that technology out there? How do you deploy in those hard to reach areas? How do you deploy the networks in region in rural communities? And so Dig Once fits into that effort to streamline processes to make sure that it's making it easier for those people who are on the front line deploying the fiber, deploying the next generation broadband can actually do so. And Dig Once has actually, I think, moved along in some ways. You know, it was incorporated in some recent legislation. You're also seeing like more state initiatives and model legislation. It's become more of part of the conversation for deployment. But Dig Once is just part of the process. If Danielle and I were talking a little bit earlier, but like pole attachments, streamlining the process for pole attachments fits right into that process. I do work with guys who build cell phone towers, and they lay conduit, and they lay the fiber. Actually, the infrastructure builders who are building the networks, both fiber and wireless, and they talk a lot of times about how you know, without the streamlined process for Dig Once or for pole attachments and other kind of regulatory red tape, whether at this local, state, and federal level, that hinders their ability to get jobs done. Which, by the way, only delays the ability to connect these communities by months, if not years. And so, you know, it doesn't just have to be Dig Once, which, yes, we've made some progress on, but it has to be a whole scale approach to make sure that we're reducing barriers to entry, we're making it easier to deploy, and to be able to do that. And so that's like a big reason why, again, it's important to talk to rural broadband offices. It's important to meet with state legislators and see what the state rules are, learn what the municipal codes are. It's like a whole labyrinth, and we need to make sure that we're informing policymakers and activists to engage so they can make their voices heard.
Well, and we're going to expand on that in just a second because, you know, our construction season for three of us that are in this conversation is about as short as you can get. You know, it isn't as though we can sit there and potentially be putting in infrastructure in November or December all the way to May or June. We've got to wait to kind of kick in. But Kelsey sent a comment where she talked about, and this goes a little bit beyond what we're talking about with broadband, but kind of. You know, I've said before that the two are married in so many ways. Her point was, you know, in the rural areas, we're very short of wireless as well. You know, that you can sit there and go, I'm driving into an area where I've got absolutely terrible cell service. I mean, how many of us have been in those in the rural area? And so I don't know which one of you want to point out that that's another area the rural area suffers, or how that's being addressed as well. But go ahead and take a run at it if somebody does want to speak to it.
I can talk for a little bit about it at least. And I'll couple this into a slight geography lesson about the state of Minnesota, which I would be remiss if I didn't participate in that. So for wireless technology, which is why when I mentioned earlier I was a little bit bearish on it, it's because of my experience here in Minnesota. So in the northeastern part of the state, it's known as the Iron Range, densely forested area, lots of rolling hills, and also sitting on hard rock, basically right below the surface. So, and they've got one of those classic broadband catch-22s. If you wanted to install a fixed wireless tower in the town, that might well work. You could put it on the water tower and residents inside the town can get it. But if you go out into those townships outside of the town, fixed wireless relies on line of sight. And so if you've got densely forested or even national forests, which we have up there, that's a really tough thing. And the same is true in southeastern Minnesota, in the blufflands along the Mississippi River. You've got amazing, beautiful scenery wonderful to visit, really, really hard to get wireless service down there. And it's just a reality that as long as it relies on line of sight, it's just not going to change. And so you've got to install a ground communications. However, as we get closer to the Dakotas out on the prairie, that's where this sort of technology can really thrive. You can put it up on a grain elevator or a silo or something like that and have quite a bit of range on that. And because the topography is relatively flat, and mostly row crops or other ag production land, you can get a lot of people connected that way.
Okay.
A huge
Oh, go
part of
ahead,
it is
Nathan,
about
too.
a huge part of it is about local knowledge. I mean, I think that's a huge part of it, is whether it's understanding the maps or whether it's a conversation about what communities know and taking advantage of like what those communities can share and say. And I think like what Nathan brings up is that like making sure that our technology fits in with the needs of that region. So many times we don't right size. Sometimes we have an overbuild and sometimes we have an underbuild. And how do you balance that just right to have a more Goldilocks approach to deployment? And so, again, I just want to kind of support what Nathan's getting at.
Danielle, do you want to speak to that?
I think both of them have essentially covered.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me throw this out at you individual. And this was brought forth by some of the folks joining in this conversation as well, that or at least that are listening to us. The point was made that in Europe, they're getting ahead of us, that they're moving and they're making this investment on a global scale in terms of our economy. Does anyone want to speak to how America could fall behind? Not just we focused on the rural area, I get it, but America itself, how important this is to us. Anyone? Okay, then Nathan, one, you have no choice. You have to speak to that.
Fair enough. I mean, I've long said in conversations I have here in Minnesota that, I mean, at the very heart of the issue, broadband is a money problem. It's a money problem. Yes, we're going to have difficulties with inflation, cost of materials, labor market's going to be tough. Sometimes it's not. Those are realities of any sector of the economy. If we choose to be leaders on this and be bold about it and invest public money in this, we can get the job done. To me, it's really as simple as that. And if other places around the world are lapping us, it's because they've invested in it. They don't have a silver bullet in Europe that allows them to deploy broadband 10 times as fast, or as quickly. They've just decided to invest in it.
So what we're saying is it's about money. The point was made by the individual, by Doug, who's viewing us on Facebook, that 92% of those households have access to broadband. I mean, all four of us wish that was a number that we could enjoy. I want to go back to, and I want to see if I can find, now it's Joel Heitkamp who has broadband but is goofing it up. So hang on with that thought. I want to throw this to you guys. This is something I do for a living. I travel all over the upper Midwest, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and I do radio. I mean, that's what I do. I go out and do local radio programs for 3 hours where people can connect vis-a-vis through AM and FM radio. I don't go there. One of the first things my producer asks is, what type of broadband do you have? What type of connection do you have? Mm-hmm. I mean, so just to simply tell the story of what's going on in those areas is a hard thing. And to make sure that they're connected nationwide with people, because everything we have is streamed now. So I'm sitting here in North Dakota where people in the winter go to Arizona and they go to Florida, and yet they stay in touch with their home area, but they're not going to know unless they can access it. And so going out to the people is so vitally important. And I'm going to go to you, Nathan, too, on that. I mean, there's other industries that people don't realize how vital broadband is, just so we can do our job.
It's not just being able to do your job or stream Netflix or watch a baseball game. It's actually about like enabling communities to fully take part in economic opportunity, whether it's leveraging IoT networks, or whether it's thinking about data centers and thinking about just like what is needed to be able to participate in the digital economy, and whether it's for next generation manufacturing, whether it's, as you said, precision agriculture, whether it's building satellites and other technologies that are emerging. Like there's great opportunities to do those in rural areas. However, you need the infrastructure to be able to attract those jobs and opportunities. And so, one of my favorite parts about my old job with the chairman was traveling and getting to see a community like Youngstown, Ohio, or Stanton, Virginia, which has, relatively smaller community, but really kind of having an outsized presence when it comes to bringing in jobs and opportunities. I was mentioning earlier my Founders Brewing sign over here. I mean, I love Founders Brewery. I love light microbreweries around the country, but
I like it already too. I just want to go on record.
But one of the ways that you can allow these microbreweries to compete is by having the technology to allow them to have the manufacturing and the bottling and distribution. And in order to do that, you do need this next generation technology. And so again, I think it's not just seeing it as like the immediate for schools, and which are hugely important, and not just for like, TaskRabbit jobs or me to zoom in from a remote location, but it's also about like building and investing fully in a community, in a neighborhood.
Danielle, you want to touch that, or I can explain how terribly I asked one of the questions that came to us. You go ahead and you tell me.
I can also just piggyback off of Nathan too, is that it's also about access to essential services. At one point during the pandemic, it was helpful to get online and see where you could actually go get a vaccine. So to think that, like, it's not just about our jobs or anything like that. It's also just about being able to access healthcare services and being able to talk to your doctor, and being able to just, have that comfort in knowing that you can reach a healthcare professional without making a great journey when you just really just need to have a quick conversation. So it's also just about being able to access essential services such as healthcare or school or whatever that may be for you.
I want to go, Danielle, to something you talked about earlier, which is, the access to polls, poll attachments, critical. What are some of the steps the FCC or individual states can take? I mean, are we talking about state laws? That comes to us vis-a-vis from one of the individuals listening to us.
Well, I would say that a lot of this is going to come from Congress, because right now a lot of the whole poll attachment is done by state public utility commissions. So that makes it harder for if you're in 33 states and you got to go through multiple commissions to figure out how to get your access to these polls. That becomes a very hard and tedious part of your job in order to get internet to people who need it the most. Is a hindrance, actually. So I would say a lot of this needs to actually be streamlined, come from the U.S. Congress, so ISPs can then do what we've been asking them to do for decades.
Anybody else want to tackle that one before I move on? Are you guys okay? Okay. I want to also throw this at you, because this is just the sheer practical side of this in terms of physical structure. Okay. Somebody's got to be at a kitchen table talking to Harriet and Bill saying, would you sign this document? We don't want to use eminent domain. We want to build fiber. And to do that, you might have 200 bushel corn out there, but the construction window is short. And so we're going to need to tear into your field a little bit, and it'll be good for all of us in the long run. How hard is that, Nathan? One, because those type of conversations have to happen, or we're not going to build what we're all talking about.
Yeah, I'm thankful that in my line of work, I've mostly just had to negotiate with legislators and not landowners over the deployment of broadband. So I don't have I will say I don't have a ton of experience, but I think that if I were in that situation, you have to have a frank and honest conversation about why is this running past your home, and also let's make sure it's going up your quarter-mile driveway, and that you're going to benefit from this as well, that you're not just like some home or some farm along the way where we're running this fiber optic cable to some other people and you're not going to see any benefit from it.
Well, and I would add to that somebody did it when it came to rural electric, and somebody did it when it came to rural telephone prior to that. But Do either one of you other two want to address that?
I think it's a huge part of it is education and cutting down on any misinformation that's out there. Obviously, landowners have their rights, and I think that's really important, and we shouldn't be trampling upon them and going through the process, as you said, the eminent domain, et cetera. But I think there's also value in explaining to an HOA. I think there's value in talking to a city commission or a county commission, as Nathan knows, and making sure that people understand what is and what is not happening. There can be a lot of misinformation spread. I am unfortunately on Nextdoor, and I am also the president of my neighborhood association, and so I'm very much aware of how this can go. Certain people can take things to a whole new level and understand how that works. But like, for example, if your neighborhood association is built along right next to a county line, how does that work? Where is the right of way? How does it play into it? How can things like dig once and pole attachment streamlining make that an easier process so that landowners and communities are able to gain the benefit, but also not be held up by rampant rumors on Facebook or Nextdoor. And I've read them all.
Well, there's nothing tougher in governance than being on a homeowners association and somebody comes in mad because the dog's barking and it won't stop barking. So what I just described could easily be what we talked about. It just involves a little more money. Danielle, do you want to touch that before we go to closing statements?
No, I think Nathan too hit the nail on the head. Educating these homeowners on what is all involved and how they play a part is essential. Like people kind of just want to know what's going on and not just that you're about to run through their field and we need it and that's it. Like they need to have a concrete explanation as to why this matters and how they can play a part in it.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to say it. Now, we're gonna have some closing statements, and I want you to know that just because you're two doesn't mean that you're number two in our heart, Nathan. But we're gonna start with you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Again, this is a really important conversation, but it's one that needs to be happening on a regular basis at every level of government. And it's how do you make the story apparent to policymakers and the communities about why we need next generation connectivity and right setting the right technology for the region or the geography in question. And so I'm glad that we're talking about it for a rural community, but also recognizing that rural communities have mountains and they have large national forests and they have rivers and everything under the sun that can make it challenging. And so being able to think through those concerns and think through those challenges can allow us to move ahead and to close this digital divide that unfortunately is holding so many people back. But we do have the tools at our disposal to solve it.
Nathan one, there was a reason we called you Nathan one because actually you were our most favorite. That's I'm waiting for Nathan two to give me the signal. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious. You're my neighbor. I mean, you are my neighbor. I was born in Minnesota, and so I'm curious what your closing statement's going to be.
Yeah, I'll go back to say a little bit about what I touched on in one of the previous questions, which is I cannot stress enough the community buy-in aspect of this. You have in your community somewhere a local broadband champion, and you need to leverage that person's expertise and passion for this issue. Whether it's on the affordability side of it or whether it's on the build out infrastructure side of it, somebody out there cares deeply about this. And I would say petition your local government, state government, yes, federal government, yes, but your town board, your city council, your county board, whatever that is, get them to start working on this and get them to take this seriously. Again, we talked about this at the beginning. This is such an easy political or partisan win. Like everybody loves this. Like you can take that information to your local board and say, hey, we're all interested in this. What are we doing about it? And the reason I say this is because that federal BEAD funding is coming to states in the next couple of years, depending on how far along your state is. You as a community have to be ready for that. The ISPs are, yes, going to primarily be the applicants, but they're going to be looking for that local buy-in and that local participation. And if you know of areas that need to be served or your house says it's served and it's really not, so on and so forth, your local government's going to need to know about that.
Danielle, the work that you've done, the work and studying and how you've made it such a big circle, bringing everyone in tells me you're the lawyer I want if I get in trouble. So you go ahead and send me your cell when we're done here. But give me your closing statements, if you will.
My closing statements are just like what Nathan just explained, is that the BEAD funding is coming. The BEAD funding is going to be there. And this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for our country to really get everybody up to speed. And I do have, I am optimistic in the sense that since we do have this BEAD funding, that we will get pretty close. I don't know, how close, but I do think that we will make some significant progress. But once we get that BEAD funding and we get this infrastructure up, the affordability issue is still going to be there. And I think that Congress definitely needs to be pushed on the Affordable Connectivity Program. I know that this wasn't the affordable conversation, but it plays a big role in the success of the BEAD program. You build out all of this infrastructure and then have no one who can afford to subscribe to your service. It seems to be a bit backwards. So I think that the communities need to be pushing Congress right now to reinstate the Affordable Connectivity Program. It lapsed this month. Right now there are multiple bills in Congress that they have multiple chances to get it passed. And as I said, I don't think it's a lack of awareness. It's not a lack of not knowing what is at stake. It is a lot of the political priorities going on right now. So I would just say that communities, please push your Congress people to please reinstate the Affordable Connectivity Program.
You bet. Thank you, Danielle. And I'm over time. I get it. I'm going to get chewed out. I want to thank Danielle and Nathan 1 and Nathan 2. This is one of those topics where it's not going to end. It's going to be a deeper discussion, and we're going to have it at One Country on the Hot Dish podcast with Heidi and myself and others. I'm going to turn it back over to JD Schreuten for the next session. Just a reminder to our viewers on Zoom, please return to the lobby and select featured conversation, and you can get there with us. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming on. It was fun.